The infirmary's fluorescent tubes cast a stark, sterile light across the gleam of freshly waxed linoleum. Officer Miller, his customary assured stride faltering, raked a hand across his forehead. A dull ache, throbbing in sync with the overhead hum, had taken root behind his eyes since breakfast. He'd initially brushed it off as dehydration, but now, halfway through his rounds, a creeping disorientation began to set in. The familiar scent of antiseptic and latex enveloped him as he checked the supply closet inventory when a sudden vertigo seized him. Shelves laden with meticulously stacked bandages and vials blurred, their crisp edges dissolving into an indistinct smear. Miller braced himself against a cool metal cabinet, his knuckles white. The hum in his ears intensified into a high-pitched whine, threatening to drown his own thoughts. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing equilibrium to return, but the sensation clung. This was beyond mere thirst. This was something altogether different. A cold perspiration pricked his hairline, defying the infirmary's ambient warmth. He drew a shaky breath, the air suddenly seeming thin. "Officer Miller? Everything all right in there?" Nurse Davies's muffled voice, penetrating the closed door, cut through the mental fog. Miller swallowed, his throat unexpectedly arid. He pushed off the cabinet, forcing a semblance of normalcy into his posture. "Just dropped a box of gauze, nurse," he called back, his voice a little rough. He hoped she wouldn't press. He abhorred any display of vulnerability, especially in a domain where order and control were paramount. His fingers, clumsy and unresponsive, fumbled with the closet door clasp. The simple act of opening it demanded immense effort. Outside, the corridor still swam in his vision, the stark white walls seeming to recede and advance with each beat of his protesting heart. He leaned against the cool plaster for a moment, letting it soothe his cheek. He had to finish his rounds. He must. This was merely a transient spell, a blip. He pushed off the wall, his legs feeling leaden, each step a conscious battle against the insistent pull of vertigo. The floor felt strangely uneven, pitching and rolling like a ship's deck in a gale. He focused on his breathing, striving to calm the frantic flutter in his chest. Meanwhile, 3 floors above the infirmary, Elias Thorne watched from his cell's narrow window. His gaze fixed on the entrance, a solitary flicker of activity in the otherwise monotonous prison yard. A worn sketchbook lay open on his lap, its pages filled with intricate, almost scientific, renderings of human anatomy. Today, his pencil moved with intense focus, detailing the delicate structure of the inner ear. The lines were precise, each shading meticulously applied, betraying an understanding far exceeding mere artistic talent. Elias possessed an uncanny observational prowess, noticing minutiae others overlooked, a skill honed by years of quiet introspection and an insatiable curiosity about the human body. He'd spent countless hours studying human movement, the subtle shifts in posture, the involuntary twitches that betrayed unspoken discomfort. He hadn't witnessed Officer Miller's dizzy spell directly, but he'd noted the officer's slightly slower pace earlier, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he'd accepted a clipboard. Now, as Miller emerged from the infirmary supply closet, Elias observed the slight hesitation, the instinctive reach for the wall. He sketched, his mind assembling the fragments. Officer Miller, usually a paragon of steadfast reliability, was off his game. Elias's brow furrowed in concentration, the pencil tip hovering. He added faint lines around the auricle, depicting the delicate interplay of cartilage and skin, but his attention remained riveted on the figure below. He saw Miller pause again, leaning against the wall for a longer moment. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to an inaudible sound. This wasn't the casual posture of someone merely resting. An undeniable vulnerability, a hint of distress clung to him. Elias closed his sketchbook, a quiet alarm beginning to stir within him. His experience, both academic and lived, told him that Officer Miller's symptoms were not to be dismissed. A specific set of conditions, often subtle in their initial presentation, could manifest this way. He'd seen it before, in a different life, in a different context, a life where he had diagnosed, interpreting the body's silent pleas for help. Here, in this sterile, regimented environment, his knowledge was a useless burden, locked away with the rest of his past. He stood, pacing the small confines of his cell, his gaze returning to the infirmary door. He knew the prison medical staff well enough to understand their limitations. Competent, yes, but their caseload was immense. Resources stretched thin. They addressed common ailments, predictable injuries. Something rare, something out of the ordinary, could easily slip through the cracks. He pictured Nurse Davies' methodical, almost robotic movements, the unwavering cheerfulness of Dr. Evans, who, despite his good intentions, often missed the forest for the trees. A sense of urgency, alien and unwelcome, began to build. He was a prisoner, an inmate. His voice, even if he found a way to make it heard, would carry no weight. It would be dismissed, perhaps even mocked. Yet the image of Officer Miller, his usually solid frame now faltering, gnawed at him. Miller, despite the uniform and the inherent power dynamic, had always treated him with a quiet respect, a simple decency rare in this place. Elias walked to the bars, his fingers gripping the cold metal. He could do nothing. He was a spectator in this drama, an expert witness silenced by circumstance. He watched as Officer Miller, with a visible effort, straightened his shoulders and continued his slow, uneven progress down the infirmary corridor, vanishing from Elias's limited field of view. The silence of his cell pressed in, heavy and suffocating. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not just a strange day for Officer Miller. This was the genesis of something far more serious, and he, Elias Thorne, was the only one who might recognize it. He picked up his sketchbook again, but his pencil remained still. The intricate drawings of the inner ear now seemed ominous, a silent premonition of what might be unfolding beneath him, unseen by those who held the power to intervene. The prison hummed with its usual indifferent rhythm, but for Elias, a silent alarm blared. The collapse. The infirmary corridor's fluorescent hum warred with the erratic flicker of its lights, painting Officer Miller's faltering progress in stark, dancing shadows. His heart, a frantic hummingbird trapped in a cage of bone, thrashed against his ribs. The ventilation system's drone, usually a mundane backdrop, now swelled and receded like a monstrous, disharmonious symphony. He grappled for the frigid, unyielding concrete of the wall, fingers scraping, seeking purchase, as a wave of icy, insistent nausea swamped him, stealing his breath. He tried to cry out, to give voice to the sudden terrifying void in his chest, but his throat constricted, releasing only a strangled gasp. From the oppressive gloom of his cell, Elias observed, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He saw Miller's eyes, typically steady and discerning, now flitting wildly, unfocused as a bird ensnared. A faint blue wash was already creeping across the officer's usually robust complexion, an ominous semaphore that sent a jolt of ice through Elias. Then came the tremor, a subtle, almost imperceptible shiver that began in Miller's outstretched hand and swiftly consumed his entire frame, transforming the figure of authority into a quivering, fragile marionette. Miller's knees gave way. He clawed at his chest, fingers fumbling at his uniform, as if to tear open an invisible prison. A choked cry, raw with confusion and agony, tore from him just before he pitched forward, his heavy form striking the linoleum with a sickening thud that reverberated through the otherwise hushed infirmary. The blunt impact shattered the fragile calm. Anya, emerging from the supply closet, dropped a box of sterile gloves with a sharp clatter. Her eyes widened in alarm. "Officer Miller!" she shrieked, her voice slicing through the sudden silence. The infirmary instantly erupted into a flurry of organized chaos. Medical professionals spilled from examination rooms, offices, and even the small break room, their faces a canvas of concern and bewilderment. Dr. Evans, his usual composure replaced by an urgent intensity, was the first to reach Miller. He knelt, practiced fingers instantly seeking a pulse, then checking for breath. "What happened?" Dr. Evans barked, his voice sharp with command. "Someone get a crash cart. Vitals now." 15 sets of hands, some gloved, some bare, converged around the fallen officer. Confusion rippled through the assembled staff. A young intern fumbled with a blood pressure cuff, his hands trembling. Nurse Sharma, efficient as ever, was already tearing open an electrode packet, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The air crackled with a frantic energy, a desperate choreography against an unseen adversary. "His pupils are blown," someone murmured, their voice barely audible above the rising tide of hushed questions. "No, wait, they're constricting," another countered, a note of bewilderment in their tone. Elias, pressed against the cold steel of his cell door, watched the unfolding drama with chilling clarity. He saw their confusion, their frantic search for answers among the conventional signs. He saw Dr. Evans's eyes, usually so keen, sweep over Miller's inert form, seeking a familiar pattern, a textbook diagnosis. But no textbook held the key to what Elias suspected. He focused on Miller's breath, or its desperate scarcity. The officer's chest barely stirred, a shallow, desperate attempt at respiration. The bluish tint on his skin deepened, a stark counterpoint to the sterile white of the infirmary floor. Elias's own breath hitched. He knew. He understood what this was. The disparate elements, the darting eyes, the tremor, the sudden collapse, the unusual presentation, clicked into place with horrifying precision. Anya leaned over Miller, her ear pressed to his chest. "I can barely hear a heartbeat, Dr. Evans," she reported, her voice thick with rising panic. "It's thready, irregular." Dr. Evans ran a hand through his thinning hair, his frustration palpable. No obvious trauma, no signs of a stroke, no chest pain reported earlier, only dizziness. This doesn't make any sense. He glanced around at the bewildered faces of his team. "What are we missing?" Elias's jaw tightened. They were missing everything. They sought the commonplace, the expected, the easily quantifiable. But what unfolded before them defied all expectations. He wanted to shout, to scream the truth, to force them to see what he saw. But his voice remained trapped, a silent cry behind bars, a prisoner of circumstance and the chasm of prejudice that separated his world from theirs. He watched, helpless, as precious seconds bled away, each one a hammer blow against Miller's fading life. The blue on Miller's skin intensified, a chilling testament to oxygen denied. The tremor, though faint, persisted, a restless energy trapped within a failing body. The infirmary, a sanctuary of healing, was becoming a stage for a silent, desperate countdown. A familiar sickness. The unsettling blue that now stained Miller's skin wasn't a trick of the flickering infirmary lights. Elias had seen its spectral twin before, not in flesh and blood, but captured within the faded photographic plates of Professor Albright's illicit texts. The tremors, the tortured gasps for air, Miller's hands clawing at his chest in a desperate, almost primal rhythm. Each symptom shrieked a name Elias hadn't voiced in years. Cyanide. A cold dread, sharper than any razor wire the prison had yet shown him, seized Elias. He pressed against the bars, the rough metal a harsh kiss on his cheek. The infirmary, a maelstrom of white coats and terrified faces, felt a universe away, yet each ragged breath from Miller echoed in Elias's own lungs. Doctors barked orders, nurses scurried, their expertise suddenly impotent against an unseen adversary. A defibrillator clattered, its paddles arcing into empty air as Miller's heart rate plummeted. "It's cyanide!" Elias rasped, his voice a raw thread, a desperate whisper swallowed by the rising cacophony. He tried again, louder, a primal urge to intervene erupting. "Potassium cyanide. He needs thiosulfate." His words, however, were merely another stray note in the mounting hysteria. A doctor, brow furrowed with a mix of confusion and fear, snapped at a nurse to prep for intubation. Another pressed a stethoscope to Miller's chest, eyes wide with dawning horror. They were treating a tempest, not its source. They were losing him. Elias's mind raced, snatching fragments from memory's deepest well. Professor Albright's voice boomed, lecturing on exotic poisons. The distinct, almost metallic tang of cyanide, though Elias couldn't smell it, permeated his imagination, cold and insidious. The swift onset, the sudden collapse, it all fit too perfectly. He rattled the bars, a futile fury vibrating through the metal. "Listen to me," he roared, his throat raw. "It's the antidote he needs. Sodium thiosulfate, hydroxocobalamin." A guard, his face a mask of weary annoyance, glanced at Elias's cell, then dismissed him with a shake of his head. "Quiet down, Thorne. They've got enough on their hands." The guard's pacing never faltered. To him, Elias was just another inmate stirring trouble, another voice to be ignored. Frustration gnawed at Elias's gut. He witnessed the intricate, fatal dance unfolding, a slow, agonizing suffocation from within. He knew the steps, knew the countermeasures, but he was a prisoner, his knowledge as thoroughly locked away as his body. The irony was a bitter draught. Years spent devouring texts, dissecting obscure medical journals, driven by a boundless thirst for understanding. And now, when it truly mattered, his expertise was utterly worthless. He watched, helpless as Miller's movements dwindled, his cyanotic skin deepening to an alarming plumb. The flurry of activity around him seemed to lose its frantic edge, replaced by a grim, almost defeated resignation. A nurse, her face ashen, stepped back from the bed, hands trembling. The doctors exchanged glances, their shoulders slumping. Miller's eyes, once bright and alert, were now vacant, staring unseeing at the ceiling. A long, shuddering gasp escaped, his lips then, silence. A profound, chilling stillness descended like a shroud over the infirmary, muffling even the distant hum of the prison. The only sound Elias could discern was the frantic, desperate pounding of his own heart. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could unsee the image seared into his mind. Miller, the kind guard who had offered a moment of quiet dignity, was gone. And Elias, with all his forgotten knowledge, had watched him die. The rookie's ear, the familiar metallic jingle of his keys against the cell bars usually grated on Officer Jenkins, a constant, sterile soundtrack to his new assignment. Tonight, however, it was the persistent, almost methodical tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, emanating from cell block C7 that truly frayed his nerves. This wasn't the usual frustrated thudding or coded prisoner chatter. This was precise, unnervingly insistent. He'd endured it for a solid hour, hoping it would dissipate like an inmate's fleeting grandiosity, but it clung to the silence, a persistent mosquito just beyond swatting distance. Jenkins, barely 6 months beyond the academy gates, prided himself on unwavering adherence to protocol. His uniform remained unblemished, his boots gleamed, his patrol meticulously executed. Deviations, particularly those born of inmate antics, were anathema. With a sigh that ruffled the crisp collar of his shirt, he adjusted the heavy utility belt, biting into his hip, and strode toward C7. The faint, rhythmic sound intensified with each step, leading him unerringly to Elias Thorne's cell. Thorne, the quiet one, whose days dissolved into the dusty pages of prison library books, not into rhythmic wall tapping. Thorne. Jenkins's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and echoing. What's with the racket? Lights out was an hour ago. The tapping ceased abruptly. A shadow within the dim cell coalesced into Elias's gaunt figure. His eyes, usually downcast, now met Jenkins with an unsettling intensity. "Officer, please." Elias's voice was a low murmur, barely audible through the thick steel. "You have to listen." Jenkins bristled. "Listen to what? Your latest conspiracy theory about the cafeteria food?" He leaned closer, his irritation a palpable wave. "You're supposed to be sleeping, Thorne, not orchestrating a one-man percussion section." "No, officer, it's not that," Elias insisted, a desperate edge sharpening his hushed tone. He pressed his face against the small, reinforced window of his cell door, his breath fogging the glass. "It's about Miller. He didn't just collapse." Jenkins scoffed. "I saw him. The medical staff saw him. He had a heart attack. Happens all the time." He'd been in the infirmary when it happened. A chaotic blur of white coats and urgent shouts, witnessing Miller thrashing on the gurney, his face contorted in agony. "No, officer. His symptoms, the rapid onset, the cherry red flush, the gasping, and the almond smell," Elias whispered, leaning in further, as if imparting a sacred secret. His eyes flickered nervously down the corridor before returning to Jenkins. "It's cyanide poisoning. Not a heart attack. It's too fast. Too acute for a cardiac event, without prior history. He didn't have one." A flicker of doubt, sparked by the precise, almost clinical description, creased Jenkins's brow. "Almond smell? What are you talking about?" The antiseptic tang of the infirmary had masked any other scent. "It's a specific indicator, officer. A telltale sign of hydrogen cyanide exposure," Elias continued, his words spilling out with frantic urgency. "And the way his breathing became labored, the seizure-like activity. It's classic. They gave him oxygen, tried to revive him, but it was useless without the correct antidote. Hydroxycobalamin, or amyl nitrite, quickly followed by sodium thiosulfate. Without it, the body can't metabolize oxygen. The cells suffocate." The rookie guard stared, bewildered. How did a prisoner, a quiet bookworm, possess such granular knowledge? Elias's conviction was unnerving. His tone wasn't accusatory, but a raw plea, a desperate attempt to convey critical information. The tapping, the whispering. It suddenly coalesced into a terrifying kind of sense. "Thorne, where did you get all this from?" Jenkins asked, his voice now lower, stripped of its earlier annoyance. He was supposed to be the authority, in control, yet Elias's quiet certainty had unsettlingly shifted the dynamic. "It doesn't matter where I learned it, officer," Elias whispered back, his eyes pleading. What matters is what happened. What could happen again? Miller didn't have a heart attack. He was poisoned. And if it was deliberate, whoever did it is still out there. In here. A cold knot tightened in Jenkins's stomach. The thought of a deliberate poisoning within the supposedly secure walls of the prison was a chilling prospect. His training kicked in, the ingrained sense of duty to protect. He remembered the medical staff dismissing Elias's outburst in the infirmary as mere ramblings. But listening to Elias now, the detailed symptoms, the specific antidote, it sounded less like rambling and more like an urgent warning. Jenkins glanced over his shoulder, down the long, empty corridor. The other guards' footsteps were distant thuds. He was alone with Elias, alone with this unsettling revelation. "Are you saying," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that the medical staff, they missed it?" Elias nodded, his gaze unwavering. "They dismissed me. They assumed it was delirium. But I saw Miller's symptoms. I knew. I tried to tell them. And now he's dead." A profound sadness settled over Elias's face, a heavy shadow that spoke of more than just a passing acquaintance. "It can't happen again." The phrase resonated with Jenkins' nascent sense of justice, hanging in the air like a stark pronouncement. He was new, he was green, but he wasn't blind. And Elias Thorne, the quiet inmate, had just whispered something that screamed far louder than any alarm bell. The metallic tang of the prison air suddenly felt colder, sharper. This was more than a breach of protocol. This was a potential murder, hidden in plain sight. And a rookie guard, fresh out of the academy, was the only one who had heard the true story. A leap of faith. The rhythmic tap from Thorne's cell abruptly ceased, replaced by the hollow drum of Jenkins' own heartbeat. He fixated on the closed door, Thorne's stark pronouncement still reverberating. Cyanide poisoning, almond scent, rapid decline. A textbook diagnosis, chillingly precise, unsettlingly sourced. Thorne, a man incarcerated for offenses Jenkins couldn't even grasp, had just painted a more visceral, terrifying portrait of Miller's end than any official document could. Jenkins raked a hand through his close-cropped hair. Protocol screamed, "Report Thorne," perhaps a cell search. But his gut, a rarely mistaken compass during his years on the force, vehemently disagreed. He recalled Thorne's eyes, not the wild, manipulative gaze of a schemer, but the burdened, urgent look of a witness to injustice. The man hadn't suggested Miller was poisoned. He'd asserted it as an irrefutable truth, like gravity's pull or the turning of seasons. A cold dread seeped into Jenkins' bones. If Thorne was right, then Miller hadn't merely collapsed. He'd been murdered, under their very noses, within Blackwood Penitentiary's supposedly secure walls. The idea was an affront to Jenkins's core beliefs, to the bedrock of order he dedicated his life to upholding. It chipped away at his solid foundation. He spun on his heel, boots squeaking on the polished linoleum. No time for lengthy deliberation, no space for the usual cautious adherence to procedure. He had to act. He had to trust. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, a gamble placed on a convicted felon's word against the collective judgment of the prison's medical staff. The infirmary hummed with muted urgency, the air heavy with antiseptic, and an acrid, unidentifiable scent. Dr. Eris Evans, whose weary eyes often concealed a formidable intellect, was hunched over a chart, a deep furrow in his brow. Nurse Anya Sharma, her usually immaculate bun slightly askew, moved with a frantic efficiency, adjusting an IV drip near Miller's still form. Miller, now a pallid figure ensnared by a tangle of tubes and wires, breathed shallowly, raggedly. Jenkins pushed through the swinging doors, his entrance an immediate disruption to the quiet intensity. Dr. Evans looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Officer Jenkins, this is hardly the moment for a social call," Dr. Evans said, his voice low and strained. "It's not a visit, Doctor," Jenkins began, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's about Miller. I think there's been a mistake." Nurse Sharma paused, her hand hovering over a monitor. "A mistake, officer. We're doing everything humanly possible." Her tone was defensive, brittle with stress. "He didn't have a heart attack," Jenkins stated, the words sounding foreign even to his own ears. He took a breath, Thorne's precise language returning. "He's been poisoned. Cyanide." A stunned silence settled over the room. Dr. Evans slowly straightened, his face a mask of disbelief. Nurse Sharma's jaw dropped. The acrid smell in the air seemed to intensify, pricking at Jenkins's nostrils. "Poisoned?" Dr. Evans finally scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping him. "Officer, are you suggesting foul play? And cyanide? Do you have any conception of how preposterous that sounds?" He gestured vaguely toward Miller. "His symptoms align perfectly with acute cardiac arrest. We've eliminated all other possibilities." He complained of dizziness, nausea, shortness of breath, then convulsions, Jenkins recited, Thorne's words echoing with chilling accuracy. "And the smell. Did anyone notice a faint almond scent on his breath or nearby?" Dr. Evans exchanged a bewildered glance with Nurse Sharma. She shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with confusion. "Almond?" Dr. Evans repeated, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his gaze. He moved closer to Miller, sniffing cautiously near the man's mouth. He recoiled slightly, a faint frown creasing his forehead. He sniffed again, more deliberately this time, his eyes narrowing. "Officer, where in God's name are you acquiring this information?" Dr. Evans demanded, though the derision in his voice had softened, replaced by a nascent curiosity. The seed of doubt, however minuscule, had been planted. Jenkins could feel it taking root in the charged silence, a fragile hope blossoming in the face of overwhelming skepticism. The doctor's recognition. The infirmary's air, already thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and the faint, sweet scent of illness, seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension. Dr. Eris Evans, his face a mask of professional skepticism, had been midway through dismissing Jenkins' increasingly frantic insistence when the officer uttered the phrase. Not poison, not something wrong, but a specific, archaic term, one rarely heard outside of esoteric medical texts. Dr. Evans, whose routine days were typically a predictable parade of fevers, sprains, and the occasional self-inflicted wound, paused. His hand, which had been gesturing dismissively towards the door, slowly lowered. A flicker, quick as a hummingbird's wing, crossed his otherwise impassive features. It was a momentary breach in his practiced composure, a fleeting glimpse of something almost like surprise, then recognition. Jenkins, emboldened by the doctor's sudden stillness, pressed on. "He said Miller was showing signs. A specific odor, Doctor." Dr. Evans didn't respond immediately. He turned, his gaze drifting back to the prone form of Officer Miller, still and unsettlingly pale on the gurney. The other medical staff, who had been hovering with varying degrees of impatience and bewilderment, exchanged uneasy glances. They had been prepared for a confrontation, for Jenkins to be escorted out, but this sudden shift in Dr. Evans' demeanor was entirely unexpected. "Odor?" Dr. Evans finally asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. as if testing the word on his tongue. "Like bitter almonds," he said. Jenkins supplied, his voice now steadier, fueled by a renewed surge of conviction. He watched the doctor's eyes, searching for any further tell, any confirmation that he hadn't been entirely mad to trust a prisoner. And then, it clicked. Dr. Evans's posture, which had been rigid with professional authority, subtly softened. His brow furrowed, not in anger, but in intense concentration. He moved with a sudden, purposeful urgency, pushing past the hovering nurse who had been preparing another sedative dose. He leaned over Miller, his face close to the officer's mouth, inhaling deeply. A moment later, a subtle tightening around his eyes confirmed it. The scent, faint but unmistakable, was indeed there. His fingers, surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands usually dealt with blunt instruments and rough examinations, moved swiftly. He checked Miller's pupils again, then pulled back an eyelid, shining his penlight into the unseeing eye. This time, he wasn't just looking for a general reaction. He was looking for something specific, something the mention of that rare condition had conjured from the deeper recesses of his memory. He palpated Miller's neck, checked the pulse in his wrist again, but this time his touch was more discerning, his observations more acute. "Blood pressure," Dr. Evans barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the hushed tension of the infirmary. "Dropping, sir." "It's been steadily falling," a young nurse stammered, consulting her notes. "Respirations." "Shallow, irregular. We were about to intubate." Dr. Evans straightened, his jaw tight. The weariness that usually shadowed his eyes seemed to lift, replaced by a steely determination. He swept his gaze across the faces of his staff, his expression leaving no room for doubt or argument. "Cancel the intubation for now. Get me a stat toxicology screen. Specifically, I want a cyanide panel. And get me the antidote kit. Now." The words hung in the air, cold and stark. The other doctors and nurses, initially bewildered, began to stir, a flurry of controlled panic rippling through the room. Cyanide. The word itself was a shock, a brutal intrusion into their sterile, predictable world of prison medicine. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a stroke. It was something far more sinister, far more deliberate. Jenkins felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Thorne had been right. The inmate, the one they all dismissed as a convict, a troublemaker, had seen what trained medical professionals had missed. A wave of profound unease washed over him, chilling him to the bone. If Thorne was right about the poisoning, what else could he be right about? And who, in this supposedly secure facility, would do such a thing? Dr. Evans was already barking more orders, his mind racing, pulling obscure facts from his vast medical knowledge. He was no longer a jaded prison doctor. He was a clinician facing a medical emergency of the highest order, spurred by an unlikely source. He looked at Jenkins, a new, unsettling respect in his eyes. "Officer, you mentioned an inmate?" Jenkins nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Elias Thorne. He's in cell block C." Dr. Evans simply nodded, a tight, grim line to his mouth. The implications of this revelation were vast, stretching far beyond the confines of Miller's failing body. The truth, delivered by a man behind bars, was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that Dr. Evans, ever the pragmatist, now recognized as essential. The game had changed. Saving a life. The infirmary hummed with a new, frantic energy. Dr. Evans, his usual weariness shed like a discarded coat, barked orders with precision. "Sodium thiosulfate, 25 grams Ivor. Get that drip running, Nurse Sharma. And the hydroxocobalamin. Prepare a 5-gram dose. Stat." Nurse Sharma, her brow furrowed in concentration, moved with practiced efficiency. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor, previously a flat line of despair, now pulsed with a fragile promise. Miller's skin, a ghastly ashen gray moments before, still bore the pallor of near death, but a faint flush was beginning to stain his cheeks. Dr. Evans leaned over Miller, his stethoscope pressed against the officer's chest. The ragged gasps that had racked Miller's frame were beginning to smooth, though each breath remained shallow, a whisper of air rather than a full inhale. "Oxygen saturation still low," Evans murmured, adjusting the mask that covered Miller's face. "But it's rising. Slowly." Anya Sharma, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, expertly inserted the IV line, the needle glinting under the harsh infirmary lights. "Thiosulfate infusing," she announced, her voice tight with controlled urgency. The clear liquid dripped steadily into Miller's vein, a tiny river of hope. "Good, good," Evans responded, his gaze fixed on Miller's face. He knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Cyanide worked fast, and its damage was often irreversible. The race against time was brutal, and every second counted. He remembered Thorne's words, the stark clarity of his diagnosis, and a shiver ran down his spine. How could an inmate know this? Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the soft whoosh of the oxygen, the insistent beeping of the monitors, and the hushed movements of the medical staff. Anya constantly checked the IV drip, her eyes darting between the bag and Miller's unresponsive form. Her heart pounded, a drum against her ribs. She'd seen too many officers come through these doors. Too many stories end tragically. Miller, with his quiet humor and surprisingly gentle demeanor, was different. He deserved a chance. Then a subtle shift. The faint flush on Miller's cheeks deepened, chasing away more of the gray. His eyelids fluttered, a barely perceptible tremor. Dr. Evans leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "Officer Miller, can you hear me?" No response, but the monitors showed a slight uptick in his heart rate. The oxygen saturation numbers, stubbornly clinging to the danger zone, nudged upward by another percentage point. A collective, unspoken breath was held in the room. "Prepare the hydroxycobalamin," Evans instructed, his voice calmer now, imbued with a nascent sense of triumph. "Let's get that in him as soon as the thiosulfate finishes." Anya, moving with renewed vigor, retrieved the second vial, its contents a vibrant red. The contrast to the colorless thiosulfate was striking, a visual representation of the potent antidote it contained. As she prepared the injection, she glanced at Miller. His breathing was still labored, but the desperate, gasping quality had softened into something more rhythmic, less agonizing. The faint scent of bitter almonds, which had permeated the air just moments ago, seemed to be receding, replaced by the sterile smell of antiseptic. Dr. Evans straightened, running a hand through his thinning hair. The exhaustion of the day, compounded by the unexpected crisis, was beginning to weigh on him. But a different kind of energy, born of purpose, sustained him. He looked at Anya, a silent acknowledgement of their shared effort passing between them. The monitors began to sing a slightly different tune. The jagged peaks and valleys on the ECG flattened, becoming more regular, more robust. The oxygen saturation continued its slow upward climb. Miller's hands, which had been clenched into tight fists, relaxed, his fingers unfurling slightly. "He's stabilizing," Anya whispered, a tremor of relief in her voice. "His color, it's really coming back." Dr. Evans nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "He's not out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, The next few hours are critical. But yes, nurse, he's stabilizing. He looked at Miller, truly looked at him, and saw not just a patient, but a man clinging to life. And the image of Elias Thorne, his face etched with urgency, flashed in his mind. The inmate, the poison, the impossible knowledge. The pieces were starting to fit, forming a mosaic far more complex and disturbing than Dr. Evans had ever imagined. The immediate crisis was passing, but a new, unsettling narrative was just beginning to unfold. A handshake through bars. The fluorescent hum of the infirmary had been replaced by the dull drone of the prison's ventilation system. Days had blurred into a slow, agonizing crawl for Officer Miller, each one a testament to his unexpected survival. The metallic taste of cyanide, though long gone, still haunted his palate, a phantom reminder of how close he'd come to an unceremonious end. Now, upright and ambulatory, albeit with a lingering tremor in his hands, he found himself walking a familiar path, but with an entirely unfamiliar purpose. The scent of disinfectant and stale air, once a comfort, now felt heavy with unspoken debts. He stopped outside Elias Thorne's cell, the cold steel bars a stark separator between their worlds. The usual bustle of the block was muted, a testament to the late hour, or perhaps the lingering unease that permeated the facility after his near-fatal incident. Miller took a deep breath, the air rasping in his still-recovering lungs. He'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head, each iteration feeling insufficient, clumsy. How do you thank a man for giving you your life back, especially when that man was an inmate you were sworn to guard? Elias sat on the edge of his cot, a book open on his lap, though his gaze was fixed on the grimy concrete floor. He didn't look up immediately, sensing Miller's presence more than seeing it. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history and the weight of their current, extraordinary dynamic. Finally, Elias raised his head. His eyes, usually sharp and analytical, held a flicker of something akin to surprise, perhaps even apprehension. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual detached composure. "Thorne," Miller replied, his own voice huskier than he intended. He gripped the cold metal of the bars, his knuckles whitening. The institutional smell of bleach and old concrete seemed to press in on them. I came to thank you." Elias blinked, a subtle shift in his expression. He closed the book, placing it carefully beside him. "You don't need to," he said, his tone still reserved. "Yes, I do," Miller insisted, a sudden urgency in his voice. He shifted his weight, his gaze unwavering. They told me what you did, what you figured out, everyone else. They were baffled. I was dying, Thorne. And you saw it." He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "You saved my life." Elias looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He ran a hand through his slightly unkempt hair. I knew the symptoms. It wasn't heroism, officer. It was observation." "Don't diminish it," Miller countered, his voice firm. "You saw what no one else did. You spoke up when you could have stayed silent. You didn't have to. You're a prisoner, and I'm a guard. There's no obligation." He paused, searching for the right words. "But you did, and I'm alive because of it." The air crackled with the unspoken tension of their roles, the chasm that separated them. Miller extended his hand through the bars, his palm open. It was an instinctive gesture, one he hadn't planned, a breach of protocol, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that transcended the prison's rigid hierarchy. Elias looked at the outstretched hand, then at Miller's earnest face. A myriad of emotions flickered across his features. Surprise, hesitation, a hint of something unreadable. He looked at his own hand, then back at Miller's. The action was so simple, yet so profoundly symbolic within these walls. For a moment, Miller feared rejection, a reminder of the unforgiving lines that defined their existence. Then, slowly, deliberately, Elias rose from his cot. He walked to the bars, his steps measured. He reached out, his fingers cool and firm as they met Miller's. The handshake was brief, yet it resonated with an unexpected weight, a silent pact, forged in the shadow of death and improbable salvation. It wasn't a handshake between guard and prisoner, but between two men, one indebted, the other having offered an extraordinary gift. "Thank you, Thorne," Miller repeated, his voice barely a whisper, the words imbued with a sincerity that defied the clanging doors and locked gates of their world. Elias nodded, his gaze steady, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing between them. The moment hung in the air, fragile and profound, before the unspoken rules of the prison system began to reassert their presence. Miller slowly withdrew his hand, the warmth of Elias's touch lingering. He turned, the weight of his gratitude a palpable presence. As he walked away, the fluorescent lights seemed a little less harsh, the air a little less stale. A small, almost imperceptible shift had occurred, a crack in the formidable wall that separated their two worlds, a testament to the unexpected power of human connection. Warden's new perspective. The polished oak of Warden Hayes's desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the grim reality just beyond her office walls. She listened, hands clasped, as Officer Jenkins recounted the harrowing events, his voice steady despite the lingering tension in his posture. Officer Miller, still pale but recovering, sat beside him, nodding occasionally to confirm details. Dr. Evans, surprisingly subdued, added clinical observations about the rapid onset and near-fatal progression of the poisoning. Warden Hayes's gaze, usually sharp and penetrating, softened almost imperceptibly as Miller described the initial symptoms, the confusion, the sudden collapse. Then Jenkins detailed Thorne's frantic warnings, his precise instructions, and the unorthodox intervention. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the facts of Thorne's unsolicited expertise, the initial skepticism, and the undeniable outcome. "So, to be clear," Warden Hayes interjected, her voice devoid of inflection, "an inmate, Elias Thorne, diagnosed cyanide poisoning and directed the life-saving treatment for one of our officers, when 15 medical professionals, including our own Dr. Evans, failed to do so." Dr. Evans cleared his throat. "Warden, with all due respect, the symptoms were atypical for cyanide. His medical history, it presented a very complex picture. Thorne's insights, however, were remarkably accurate. He recognized a specific presentation that, frankly, few active physicians would ever encounter." Hayes's eyes fixed on Miller. "Officer, do you agree with this assessment?" Miller met her gaze directly. "Warden, I'm alive because of Thorne. There's no other way to put it." His voice was low, laced with an undeniable conviction that resonated through the room. A silence descended, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Warden Hayes leaned back in her chair, her analytical mind sifting through the narrative, stripping away emotion to get to the core. Elias Thorne, a man serving a sentence for a white-collar crime, had demonstrated a level of medical acumen that bordered on genius. This wasn't merely an inmate helping out. This was an inmate possessing a rare, life-saving skill that had been overlooked, confined behind bars. "Jenkins," she finally said, "I want you to arrange a meeting, privately, with Thorne. I want to understand his background, his motivations." Jenkins nodded, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He'd expected commendations, perhaps a new protocol for medical emergencies, but not a personal audience with an inmate. Days later, Elias Thorne, looking slightly bewildered, was escorted into the warden's office. The stark decor, the imposing desk, and the formidable woman behind it were a world away from the dusty confines of the prison library, his usual refuge. Warden Hayes, observing him, noted his quiet intensity, the way his eyes seemed to absorb every detail of the room. He wasn't overtly defiant, nor was he subservient. He simply existed, observant. "Mr. Thorne," Warden Hayes began, her voice firm but not unkind, "Officer Jenkins has recounted your role in Officer Miller's recovery. I understand you possess considerable medical knowledge." Elias shifted slightly in his chair. Yes, Warden. I had a different life before." His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Indeed. And that knowledge saved a life, an officer's life." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "We have a problem, Mr. Thorne. A problem of underutilized resources. You are a resource." Elias blinked, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "The prison library," Hayes continued, gesturing vaguely towards the window overlooking the yard, "is in need of organization. Specifically, the medical texts are a jumbled mess. I understand you have a penchant for order, for classification." Elias's head tilted almost imperceptibly. The prison library, a place of quiet, of knowledge, of escape. "I am offering you an opportunity, Mr. Thorne," the warden stated, her voice returning to its more accustomed crispness, "to apply your skills in a constructive manner. You will assist the librarian, organize the medical section, and potentially assist with research for our medical staff on complex cases, under strict supervision, of course." A profound stillness settled over Elias. The air in the room, once thick with unspoken tension, seemed to lighten. A purpose. A reason to engage with the world beyond his cell, beyond the endless cycles of prison routine. He looked at the warden, a woman who, despite her stern exterior, was offering him something far more valuable than a reduced sentence: recognition. "Warden," Elias finally managed, his voice a little rough with disuse, "I would be honored." And so, Elias Thorne began his new role. The prison library, a neglected corner of the institution, slowly began to transform. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light as he meticulously sorted through volumes, his slender fingers tracing titles, his mind absorbing the information. He found an unexpected solace among the printed pages, a quiet hum of renewed purpose. The sterile smell of the prison was slowly replaced by the scent of old paper and leather, a subtle shift in his confined world, brought about by a warden's new perspective and a silent, extraordinary act of compassion. Unexpected heroes.